Welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. Today we have Dr. Eric Helms. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you for having me on, man.
Thank you for coming on. We just had some technical difficulty, but we're going to go through this again so you guys don't miss out. But I want to preface this episode with, if you are a highly competitive fighter, this won't be as applicable to you, but there'll be some stuff in there that'll help. If you're just like a more of a recreational combat sports athlete, you want to get big and strong as well, this is more applicable to you. And I guess the three main topics that you've recently covered on your podcast were volume, long muscle weight training, and protein. And what's really interesting is kind of the pushback against at least the first two, and the volume and the long muscle weight side. So let's start with the volume topic first, and we'll kind of go through and see how we go. But start with how volume is defined in the research, because I think we can go into a whole lot of different ways of how you could really track volume. And then what is is there a quote unquote optimal volume for maximizing muscle growth?
For sure. So sometimes in individual studies, you'll see kind of your typical tonnage, like sets times reps times load, as a way of tracking volume or trying to match volume between different conditions. But when you look at what informs kind of the more practical ways that we prescribe volume as practitioners and then analyze volume from a big picture, like if you look back at the 2017 meta-analysis by Schoenfeld or the 2022 meta-analysis by Basval, the historical precedent was counting number of sets per muscle group per week. And historically, this was done on kind of a everything counts basis. So if you had a study where you're measuring ultrasound muscle thickness of the pecs and triceps, and you had them only do bench press, you would count that equally as a one set for triceps and pec for every set of bench, regardless of what's the synergist and what's the primary muscle. Now, most recently, and probably the one that's produced some controversy because it's the most large analysis we have on volume to date, it's both strength and hypertrophy by Pelland and colleagues. It's a preprint, so not fully gone through peer review, but by the same group led by Robinson that did the big meta-regression on proximity to failure, which now is printed, was they looked at different ways of tracking the volume, and they had 1,000 participants in this big analysis, in this meta-regression. And they first looked at that same traditional relationship. They also looked at only direct sets, so only the prime mover would count. So for example, in that bench press one, you wouldn't count it at all for triceps. And then they used one other method, which is an exploratory approach, where they wanted to see, all right, if we actually look at the data and we try to fit a line to it, like what is best representative of the sets being performed in the relationship with hypertrophy, they found that the quote unquote indirect method was actually the best fit. And it seemed to more reliably be predicted by the data. And what that means is that in that example of bench press and measuring pec and triceps hypertrophy, the primary mover, the chest, would count as one set, but the triceps would count as half a set. And really important to understand that while this is a better model fit when we look at all the data, it's not literally true that all indirect exercises count as half a set for the secondary muscles and they count as a full set for the primary, because that would mean that bench press, incline dumbbells, flies, push-ups are all exactly the same stimulus for chest, and it would mean that they're all exactly half for triceps, and it would also mean that all tricep exercises are exactly the same. But when you zoom out and you're trying to isolate the effective volume and you're looking only at the average response relationship and trying to plot a model that describes what we see in all of the studies, we're talking dozens across, like I said, 1,000 participants, it fits the data better. So right now, the best method we have for the purpose of hypertrophy and a practical way of counting volume is indirect counting method, where it's primary mover, one set, secondary muscle group, half a set.
Perfect. And is there a certain number of sets or maybe a set range that would be deemed quote unquote optimal for maximizing muscle growth?
I like that you said optimal and then you said for something, because I think a big bit of the pushback that you were kind of framing this conversation up with comes from people not really defining the constraints for what is ideal. So if you said what's optimal for a bodybuilder who has a lot of free time, and has a great recovery environment, and is ready to do everything they can to progress in their sport, and they have a history of responding well to high volumes, and they're good about programming and knowing how to distribute stress. That's a very different number if you said, hey, I've got a fighter who needs to put on a little more size. They're already doing 6 training sessions that are not related to hypertrophy, and I need them recovered for their fights and not incurring a lot of soreness. Now I'm going, okay, what is optimal in these constraints? And the reason why that's important is because in one case, you're looking to get the most you can out of the minimum dose. So you're thinking of like an investor in that latter example. You want to be efficient. You want to have the highest ROI, the highest return on investment. But in the latter or the former example of the bodybuilder, muscle size is their sport. So telling them that they'll get 1% better if they double their time in the gym, that might be worth it in some instances. You know, that's an extreme example, probably not, because now you're looking to be deloading more often, et cetera, et cetera. But I think you have to look at this in a specific context. And the data generally describe what we would say is a diminishing returns relationship, which means that the initial sets you do are far more effective than the sets you do later and later in that relationship, going all the way up to where we start to lose confidence in the data just because there's not enough high volume studies to give us statistical certainty in the relationship. Right around 30 sets is where we're going, okay, at this point, any more than 30 indirect sets per week per muscle group, we're not sure what that relationship looks like anymore. And we have reasonable confidence within some pretty important confines, which we can talk about, that up to that, you are getting some return on investment. But the kind of return is really important to contextualize. You would have to do basically 2 relatively high volume programs to get the kind of return that, like, you did triple your volume basically to get a 2 times improvement from, say, doing like 10 sets or 8 to 12 or somewhere in that range. And it really starts to not make sense for a lot of people at that point. And when you start to look at the absolute changes when they converted into percentages, I think Pellin and colleagues did a really good job of trying to say, like, hey, this relationship is really bad from an investment standpoint, but maybe from a maximalist standpoint, it could be worthwhile, or for short periods or for one muscle group. And there's some other context that's important to talk about the way that research is done and how it is not necessarily entirely ecologically valid, because saying what produced the most hypertrophy in one muscle group in a non-representative training study that is trying to look at the relationship between hypertrophy and training, and like I said, it might only be bench press and nothing else, is a very different question to how much volume should I do perpetually for my training career, right?
No, for sure. And are we assuming that those sets are taken relatively close to failure as, I guess, as a marker of a working set in that instance? So if you're saying 10 sets, it's 10 sets that are relatively close to failure when we're talking muscle growth.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, is, you know, when you look at a meta-analysis or a meta-regression, which is a study of a whole bunch of other studies, they're going to be limited based upon what is included. And there's a really good set of figures that describe what types of studies were included in this meta-regression. And about 80% of them use some type of definition of failure. So probably the majority of them are actually using momentary failure, where the participants attempt a rep and fail. And then maybe a minority, but plenty of them are doing what we might describe as volitional failure, when the participant thinks they can't do another rep. Or, you know, sometimes they'll say volitional failure, and many reps are actually to momentary failure. But I would say you're probably looking at like an average RIR at the lowest in these sets of like 1. So yeah, like 80% of these sets are to the intention of some type of failure definition, with 20% being at a high proximity to, like, close to failure, but not to it. So yeah, they're hard sets.
Yeah, for sure. I have a question in the chat here for you. I don't know if it's a little difficult to understand, but I'm going to throw it to you anyway. For fighters, or for any athletes, I guess, who need strength and endurance, are sub-max auto-regulated sets with higher volume more effective than linear periodization? How would you balance fatigue while maximizing strength and power? I think you kind of touched on that a bit before, but I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, I think the big thing is that when you're trying to maximize strength and power, the relationship with volume is very different, if we're still talking about volume. So in the same meta-regression, they looked at not only the relationship between volume and hypertrophy, which had diminishing returns, but also volume and strength. But that also had diminishing returns, but it started to diminish way faster. Like right around like 5 sets, it started to show this poor relationship, where it's like, oh, I'm not sure you're getting any better. And an important thing here is this is also indirect sets. So that means that if we want to get better at bench press strength now, anything that is a bench press counts as one set, but anything that trains the muscles that contribute to a bench press that are not a bench press set would count as half a set. So now we're moving from like a muscle movement mixture. So if you were to take someone on a typical low to moderate volume strength and hypertrophy plan, 8 to 10 sets per muscle group, you've probably maximized the short-term strength response, and you have not maximized the hypertrophy outcome. And that might be more appropriate for someone who's training for performance. But I think long-term, we also need to remember that just because we don't see agreement between the magnitude of change or even the relationship between the change of hypertrophy and strength over a short-term study, when we take athletes or any participant and we acutely cross-sectionally measure a metric of force production primarily, and then some metric of muscle size, cross-sectional area, thickness, even lean body mass, then we see pretty strong relationships, or at least moderate relationships between those two. So long-term strength is going to be heavily affected by how much contractile tissue you have and overall mass. But in the short term, like if you're going, hey, I want to be stronger at the end of this training block, doing more volume to get more hypertrophy, you're not going to see that direct one-to-one payoff. Yeah. And also, when your goal is strength and power, you're going to have to do some things which dampen the hypertrophy outcome. So the closer you train to failure, the slower your velocity is going to be towards those last reps. And we have seen in some of the velocity-based research that when you say stop a set at a 20% velocity loss, which is closer to like a 4 or 5 RIR, you get better like conversion to type 2 fibers that are a little more fast twitch dominant, more powerful, if you will, some better markers for jump height. And when you go all the way to failure, you do seem to get better hypertrophy, right? But you are sacrificing some of that because it's less specific to your goal of training for power. So to answer the question, there should be some periodization if you're a performance athlete. And the timing of that really depends upon when do I need to be strong and powerful, and then also acknowledging that long term, I do need to think about the size of my muscles to maximize my potential for strength and possibly power.
Perfect. And for the person who asked that question, well, I just did a video on that velocity loss stuff. So it's somewhere on a few videos back on the channel. So that's perfect. I guess still down the volume and muscle growth, I gotta say, debate. A couple of things that have kind of stood out to me, I guess, from the other side of the crowd. I mean, you're kind of middle grounded on all of this. So the other side of the crowd is kind of, let's just say dogmatic about some of the stuff. And one of them is around I guess it's called the effective rep model. And I'm sure you're familiar with everything that's going on in that space, but basically people are saying, hey, you don't need to do more than 6 to 8 reps because all it is, it's about, we just got to accumulate sets close to failure. So if we get close to failure faster, we maximize mechanical tension, blah, blah, blah. So we just have less fatigue and we can just do 8 reps and we don't have to worry about doing all these other reps and have all this other fatigue. Obviously within the research we see, all the rep ranges help you grow muscle. Obviously lower reps, you're going to need more volume through more sets, etc. And there's a trade-off with, doing 10 sets of 3 at like, whatever percentage at a time. So it'll be interesting to hear your take on kind of, how can I frame this? Where is it accurate to say that, hey, you can just do no more than 8 reps and you're still going to quote unquote maximize muscle growth? Or is there more to this basically?
In the research we have, which is typically short term, we have definite evidence that heavier is not better than lighter and that lighter is not better than heavier. Most of the rationales I've seen around fatigue are very kind of mechanistic in their understanding, and they rely on a few assumptions that haven't actually been proven.
And fatigue is pretty, not well established.
Yeah. The definition of fatigue varies. We haven't identified all aspects of it. A lot of the anecdotal experiences of lifting heavy, if you look at powerlifters and what they associate with, CNS fatigue, which is probably not the accurate descriptor of what's going on, we don't have something to map to that super well. And I think like the effective reps model, if you want to say broadly, the closer you train to failure, the more effective reps you're going to get, I'm 100% on board. If you give me a specific rep range that is not incredibly broad, then I'm saying you're having a really tough time comporting with the data. So we go back to that Robinson published now meta regression that had like, I think 1,500 people or so on the hypertrophy data, maybe more, but over 1,000. See hypertrophy all the way from 10 RIR to failure pretty reliably. And if you think there's an unclear relationship in the volume data, it's less clear if you look at the like exponentiated response ratio for like percentage change in hypertrophy from 0 RIR all the way to 10 RIR. Like, yeah, if you look at like 2 RIR and 8 RIR, you can see like the clustering of studies are a bit downshifted and upshifted, but it's not a massive amount. And yeah, it's a mixture of trained and untrained people, but it shows you that effective reps is a spectrum, and it's a range, right? The closer you get to failure, the more stimulative, but you're having some trade-offs there. So it is true that if you have to accumulate a whole lot of reps to get to the point of failure, you're going to have potentially some types of fatigue being higher from higher reps. And there are data when you look at, say, acute studies that indicate you are looking at some higher markers of fatigue if you do like a 25 or 35 rep set to failure versus a 10 to 12 rep set to failure. And certainly the perceptual demands are higher. Session RPE is higher. Discomfort is higher. You're more likely to misgauge your proximity to failure. So I do like, say, reps under like 12 for most hypertrophy training. But you take any, like when someone is like dogmatic about this, the one thing I know is they've never actually trained people. Because some movements are just not a great fit for high reps. Some movements are just not a great fit for low reps. And you would never, as a practitioner, or especially strength conditioner, take like low load training off the table for athletes which are coming to you with musculoskeletal joint injury history. They are potentially just not one to put that much load through a joint sometimes. If you're doing an isolation movement. And then finally, I would say from a pure maximalist bodybuilding perspective, if I was to hedge my bets, there's enough hints in the data that it's not specifically about one rep range being superior to others or high versus low reps, but having a broader spectrum of rep range training has popped up as being either significantly better or better but not significant enough times that I think there might be something there to at least not write it off. There's comparisons of daily undulating periodization where they do a high rep day, a low rep day, and a moderate rep day that the effect sizes favor that versus, say, just always 8 to 12. And there's pyramid training comparisons that they have a broader pyramid, like from all the way to 15 to 5 versus, say, 12, 10, 8, that seem to have better effect sizes. And there's one periodization protocol where they did like a hypertrophy strength and a hypertrophy block that did slightly better than the straight hypertrophy training for the whole 11-week study. So I keep seeing those and I'm like, like there's enough of a rationale here where training across a broad spectrum of ranges might elicit slightly better hypertrophy because it doesn't always look the same in terms of muscle activation, potentially regional recruitment. Your ability to go to failure in one type of movement is better for that person psychologically. Some people really have a tough time going heavy on certain movements. So I think it would be a really big mistake to take those loads off the table. And finally, I would point out that it doesn't just come down to the load. There's a lot more that goes into this. But when we look at injury rates, when we compare powerlifters, bodybuilders, weightlifters, strongman, probably the best comparison is like powerlifters and bodybuilders. More similar movements. They have an eccentric. It's both lift and slow and close to failure as a function of load or as a function of trying to go to failure. Very few bodybuilders who don't do some type of hinge, squat, and bench pattern. But you see like a third to a quarter of the injury rates in bodybuilders. And the big difference is they don't have to do a squat, bench, or deadlift heavy. And, you would probably still get less injured if you said, I'm only going to do 5 to 8 reps at a 2 RIR. But now you're definitely hanging out in a much heavier loading range all the time. And I would suspect that might be slightly more risky it's all very low risk compared to, say, like playing basketball or getting punched in the face. But like training is not dangerous. But and I don't want to mean to fearmonger, but I wouldn't exclusively train heavy for all of these indirect reasons.
Yeah. I mean, variation is also fun, isn't it?
Absolutely. Keeping someone mentally engaged is important, right?
Yeah. I mean, even if you think about some of the old school, like physical culturists and some of those things, like the squat sessions they were doing, like John Grimmock's old squat session, in the 1940s or something, was like 20, 15, 12, 10, 8, 6. I actually did that a few years ago. It was fucking awesome. But it's like, it's brutal. And, those methods work. So, it's not like you have to throw those out the window.
A lot of the advanced training stuff too, when you're trying to eke out 1 kilo of muscle over 5 years in advanced lifter, is finding a way to come to the gym every day and challenge yourself and find a way to hit some type of PR and move forward. And then do that for months on end to get minimal return. So yeah, when people take these very, very narrow views, I think they're missing out on the potential to gamify training, to stay engaged, stay focused. And I think there is so much to say for maintaining that motivation and that belief that you are going to grow like a new lifter, even though you absolutely won't, so that you can bring the type of intensity you need to grow to whatever degree you can.
Yeah, I think that's funny, the way, I guess, the gym and fitness kind of information has changed over the years, where like back in the day, you would go in the gym and you would do things, or you'd just do stupid stuff every now and then, or you'd do some like crazy sets, and that would be like your training will be fun. And I think now, I think mainly with a big influence from RP, and I know you were on RP channel semi-recently too, and I enjoy their stuff, but I think a lot of that, I guess a lot of that information has kind of come down now into mainstream fitness, where everything has to be optimized for the perfect reps for muscle growth, the perfect sets, the perfect split, and kind of the idea of, I'm not going to do 20 rep squats now because, for whatever reason, based on this scientific thing, when you could be going in and, if you're doing 20 rep squats, you're going to grow. There's no way about it. That shit's hard.
Yeah, I think science is really helpful when it helps us understand the constraints of what we can operate in, but not providing unnecessary constraints. And if you're truly evidence-based and you look at the data on the whole and not focusing on like one influencer's take of mechanistic data, and, you use the hierarchy of evidence and you go, all right, what's the meta regression? What's the applied data? Not theoretical stuff. Almost all rep ranges, except for really, really light, can get you there. And there are downsides to both. Like I said, like lifting exclusively heavy, you're making the same deal with the double the powerlifters do. You're going to get some aches and pains. Lifting really, really light, it's going to degrade your ability to gauge proximity to failure, and it's going to feel harder, but not necessarily give you a payoff. And there's no guarantee that you have that same pain tolerance or motivational environment that is going to enable you to get to failure. Because when you go to a lab and you do a set of 25 to failure, you got 3 graduate students yelling at you. You and I both know this. We've been in these environments. And when it's just you in your head and you're like 25 reps to failure, it's going to be sometimes, if it's not a great day, 25 reps to hard. And that can be almost any load, because 25 reps is always
15, 15, oh, that's enough.
Exactly. That's got to be close to failure, right?
Yeah. No, for sure. And I guess one more question on this topic too is the idea of, I guess, the backlash against the mechanisms of muscle growth. So obviously, mechanical tension's kind of been we've got the poster child for muscle growth, and then the idea of metabolic stress has kind of been shunned. And it's interesting to only just kind of what would you call it? Just shun one mechanism and say this has no influence at all on muscle growth. And it's interesting because if you think like just ischemic preconditioning, or just like blood flow restriction for people in bed rest from surgery who have that, put blood flow restriction, do nothing, but are maybe able to maintain some of their muscle mass. There's no lifting or mechanical tension going on there. It's kind of just you're blocking blood flow, and it's metabolic stress increases. Now, I guess it'll be interesting to hear, you're more well-versed in this than me, so it'll be interesting to hear kind of your take on this idea of those mechanisms of hypertrophy. Is metabolic stress getting the pump, but metabolic stress and doing those reps and feeling that pump, even though that might not be what it is, but regardless, feeling that pump and getting that stress, is that something that can potentially influence muscle growth?
The jury's definitely out on this one. And there's a couple reasons why it is worth thinking about in a more full understanding. Is one, mechanical tension is not something we fully understand. And there's many different types of mechanical tension. We're still discovering all the mechanosensors. And when people think mechanical stress, a lot of the times they think lifting heavy in the 5 to 8 rep range, and that's what you got to do. And they're thinking about kind of the whole muscle tension sensing, right? Metabolic stress, they think about the pump, burn, high reps. But it is very possible that high rep sets, some people will be like, well, high rep sets work because of metabolic stress. Because, they wouldn't work otherwise. We see lower peak EMG values, higher fatigue. So there's got to be something to kind of make up for that difference. It's possible. But it's also perfectly comporting with it also being predominantly mechanical tension. Because what is actually happening when you do BFR or when you do a high rep set is our best guess as far as what's going on at the motor unit recruitment level is we see what's called motor unit substitution or motor unit cycling. So when you're lifting something you can do for 30 reps and you're 10 reps in, fatigue is definitely accumulating. And some of the most powerful fibers are not recruited yet, but some of them are. And the body will actually purposely de-recruit them phasically to try to preserve them because it's trying to be efficient and it's trying to think about this from a survival standpoint, right? So you'll get these different high threshold motor units that are cycling in. That's why you never see a peak EMG that reaches the same as a high load, but you still see similar hypertrophies. We think what's going on is by the time you get to the point where that 30 rep set is moving slow and those last 3 reps look the same as they would if you did a set of 5 in your last 3 reps, is because you've exhausted the motor unit pool. Everything has been substituted in, cycled through. So it could purely be that the fatigue that you're generating, the energy system demand, trying to meet the demands of anaerobic glycolysis, which is what produces metabolic stress, is functioning to end up recruiting all the muscle fibers to then get you to mechanical tension. Because tension, to our best understanding, is sensed at the muscle fiber and intermuscle fiber level. So you have costomeres, sometimes called focal adhesions. Shout out to back old EMP from the AUT.
I think I've still got those lectures on my laptop somewhere. I probably have to go through them again, to be honest.
Yeah, and this is stuff that, was in that course 10 years ago, talking about Titan, talking about costomeres. Yep, and they serve multiple roles. Like first, you want a muscle to be efficient. You want to have an ability to store elastic energy, not only through the muscle tendon unit on a macro scale, but also on the sarcomere level. So the Titan is this giant molecule that connects to the cytoskeleton and it unwinds and it actually generates, the ability to produce force eccentrically through that dynamic contraction the same way a tendon does. It's also a mechanosensor though, and we think it has to do with anabolic signaling. And potentially costomeres do, which then distribute force laterally. So even when, like one fiber is contracting, and another one's not, that might be next to it, there's still force being dissipated across all of it. And even when you de-innervate animal muscle and you stretch it, you see hypertrophy in response to it. So it's really quite fascinating. And there are other mechanosensors like nuclear flattening, actually flattening the myonuclei in skeletal muscle, which occurs at long muscle lengths and potentially at short muscle lengths when you get a pump. That might even be a mechanosensor. And there's more. There's calcium ion gates. There's stuff that's going on the surface of the muscle cell, stuff that's deeper muscle physiology than I currently understand. There's at least 5 or 6 potential mechanosensors, and I guarantee it's not all of them. So not all forms of mechanical tension are even the same. So when people say mechanical tension, a lot of them feel like they've got that on lock and they understand it fully when they're really
usually
just
talking about
scratching.
tension relationship, right? When they're talking about that.
They often are, and they're only thinking of Titan. And a lot of these, like the narratives can get very simplified and they can be logically cohesive, but they may not represent what's actually happening because we don't fully understand it. So metabolic stress could be a non-thing. I will fully admit that. And when you look at studies where they do, they take high mechanical tension and they try to add metabolic stress on top of that, and you don't see major effects like hypoxia or doing altering the rest periods and having someone do BFR on top of 70 or 75 or 80% of 1RM and trying to match total volume. You don't seem to see additional hypertrophy. So it could just be that there's a very low threshold for metabolic stress to provide a small hypertrophy signal that is enough that you get in bed rest, or that you might see if you take lactate and put it in a petri dish on a muscle cell culture. But that when you're doing any kind of resistance training, it's insufficient. Or it might be that the types of the magnitudes of metabolic stress that we get from training are just not high enough, and it takes something truly novel to get a pretty big effect. So I think the jury is still out. I think we don't fully understand the influence of it, and I think it would be premature to dismiss it. And I think also we need to move beyond the whole like muscle damage, mechanical tension, metabolic stress when we talk about muscle hypertrophy signaling and mechanisms, because those all sit on different kind of ways that you might describe a mechanism. I mean, you could also get to a deeper level and say, is this specific pathway a mechanism for hypertrophy? And then mTOR, AKT, like MGF, like there's so many things that are going on. I think people probably need to dig into the more recent papers rather than a 2010 review that are in the 2022, like Wackerhach and some of the ones that have been published in the last 4, 5, 6 years that kind of dig into this stuff, because it's relatively deep physiology. And you're right, some funky things happen out there, you know, where you can, animal models or single cell cultures, you can just experimentally add, you know, to a muscle metabolic stress in the form of lactate, and things happen. It's tough to say in that bed rest example you gave me, because you still have some postural support, and when someone is in that position, it requires so little of quote unquote mechanical tension to provide some type of stimulus. So you could plausibly maybe say it's not the metabolic stress, you know. You can say a BFR is just getting you closer to failure. You know, if you're walking with BFR, which is sometimes shown to be better, more anti-catabolic, or even induce hypertrophy in untrained people, it's like, oh, well, that's not lifting. It's like, well, it's still movement. We're still in a gravity well on Earth. Yeah, when they're normally walking, they might be at a 500 RIR, but now they're at a 100 RIR, and that's enough just to get a little bit of hypertrophy, you know, and it's hard to argue.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And you can actually segue this well anyway into this idea of long muscle length training. Another topic that has people up in arms there's just literally like insane like camps on either side, which is quite funny. I think some of it has been driven honestly by one particular exercise, and that's Dr. Mike Israel's decline curls.
Upside down circus curls.
Every time I see an Instagram video, it started lying flat and now it's gone decline. It's just gotten more and more. I think that is just the thing that's kind of just divided this whole thing in half, which is quite funny. So it'll be interesting to hear your take on this idea of long muscle length training in terms of hypertrophy. And we actually talked a lot about this recently with some people from High Performance Sport in New Zealand. Bill Smart, he's working with City Kickboxing and doing long muscle length isometrics to like extreme failure, just to see if you potentially get that increase in muscle fascicle length and things, which is quite interesting. So for hypertrophy though, okay, I guess some of the arguments are it works for some muscle groups maybe, but not for other muscle groups, or long muscle length doesn't matter for some whatever reason. So I'm just going to throw it to you just to kind of go from wherever.
Yeah, it's actually been shown in various different relatively clever designs of how do we isolate training at a long muscle length from the range of motion you perform it at, right? Because I think that is where this all started, was people were going, yeah, we know that more range of motion is better. But there was a few isolated incidents in the research where people would do less range of motion. They would do a partial, but that partial would be at a longer muscle length, and then it wouldn't be clear that more range of motion was better. So it's like, what's going on here? And some of the early research was done by like McMahon in 2014 and a few others in 2015, looking at this. And that's when the speculation came, well, maybe it's something about training at a longer muscle length. And if you go back and look at Norakiv, and there's I think a Legray, I'm aware of like 3 isometric quadricep papers where they're no range of motion. So now we've effectively isolated muscle length, right? We have just somebody kicking against an immovable pad, like an isometric done on an isokinetic dynamometer at 2 different knee joint angles. And the effect sizes all favor, and in I think 2 out of these 3 studies, the actual significant difference favors being at a more knee flexed joint angle. So quad being at a longer muscle length, getting more hypertrophy in this isometric training. So that's the clearest evidence we have of, oh, there's something going on here. But other interesting ways are when we take a biarticular muscle, so it crosses 2 joints, and we manipulate exercise selection so the range of motion about the joint is the same, but the degree of stretch that's in the muscle is higher in one condition versus the other. So for example, the hamstring during a seated leg curl when you're in a seat and reach position versus a lying leg curl. group in Japan led by Sumiyaki Mao did
I
this
remember that
using
paper.
using MRI. So it's quite cool using MRI muscle volume, and very consistent findings, really well done research, and it comports completely because the sartorius, which is a weak knee flexor, which sits on the front of the thigh, attaches on the anterior hip, it's more stretching doing a lying leg curl. So the sartorius grew more in the lying leg curl, while the hamstrings grew more in the seated leg curl. And then Sumiyaki and his group, they replicated that recently, looking at Nordic curls compared to seated single leg eccentric biased, two down, one out style.
Yeah.
And what's really cool about this one, which I think is relevant to performance athletes, is they also looked at some of the attachment sites and the regional adaptations around the tendon, and basically how much interface was there between the muscle and tendon in the areas where you typically see people get hamstring strains. Because Nordic curls, they're great, for someone who doesn't have access to a leg curl and wants to get big hamstrings, but they're also used really commonly in injury prevention for team sport athletes. They're part of the FIFA soccer warm-up, and conditioners use them all the time. And they were able to show that there were different architectural adaptations that might reduce hamstring tear injury risk. So I think there's a lot potentially there, because when you are training a muscle at a longer length, it's producing higher tension. It's producing higher tension at a more distal position near where the tendon interfaces. And you are potentially getting some of those fascicle length adaptations and shifting their which portion of the length tension relationship they can operate on. So when you typically see injuries in sports, it's when you're asking a muscle to produce a lot of force in a long muscle length and it can't. So if you can shift that length tension relationship a bit, which it seems you can from a performance perspective, when you train at longer muscle lengths, you get stronger at longer muscle lengths. It might also increase resilience. So I think there's applications to this from a performance perspective, period, but it's also pretty consistent. So we have those like leg curl comparisons. We have also an overhead tricep extension versus a typical tricep extension comparison. And then there's actually 3 studies all showing the same thing in the biceps, which is one of the muscles, the arm biceps, not the leg biceps, where people say, oh, no, the arms don't benefit from long muscle length training. We've now seen consistently in 3 studies comparing incline curls to preacher curls, where you see more distal growth or more proximal growth, depending upon what exercise you're doing. And that more distal growth, especially when you're looking at ultrasound, that can't differentiate between the brachialis and the biceps brachii, you're seeing the benefit of the preacher curl producing a more favorable resistance profile at a longer muscle length. Because when you've got your arm nearly parallel to the ground on a preacher, it's immediately hard when your bicep is at a longer muscle length. But it's not your bicep, it's actually brachialis, because it's monoarticular. The bicep, however, crosses the shoulder. So when you're doing an incline curl, now you've stretched it at the shoulder joint and you see more proximal growth. And it's not necessarily regional hypertrophy. What they're actually capturing, which is confirmed by Kobayashi, who is part of Mao's group with MRI, is that you're seeing more biceps growth in the incline curl, and you're seeing more brachialis growth, which is really hard to differentiate on ultrasound from the preacher curl. So this, again, really lines up with training at longer muscle lengths. Brachialis, it doesn't matter where your shoulder is. So what's going to grow it more? The thing that produces more tension at a longer muscle length, the preacher curl. But the biceps, when you're in shoulder, when you're doing the Dr. Mike curls, now you're actually stretching that more because you're messing with its attachment at the shoulder joint, and it's producing more growth. So it's, to be honest, like when we look at this body of literature, we're approaching like 20, 30 studies in various different ways of looking at quote unquote long muscle length training in one way or another. And it's about half of it which does show like significant positive differences, and there's any findings that go the other way. And the other way to control for range of motion is just shortened partials versus lengthened partials. And those are pretty consistently showing, and sometimes in the arms as well, that you're getting better growth at a longer range of motion, but the same total number of degrees of movement around the joint. So it's relatively compelling. The effect sizes are small. And I think we need to realize that when we're using small sample sizes, especially when we're looking at trained lifters over short periods of time, which I would describe as almost all studies, you should only expect to see small differences. And then if you're comparing 2 interventions, which are both reasonably good, like if you're going to do full range of motion versus lengthened partials, out of all the different types of long muscle length training, that comparison, I would expect the smallest difference because they are both reaching a long muscle length. One is just spending a little more time there. And if the resistance profile is not that, like favorable for it to make a lengthened partial better, where it's harder in the shortened position, then why would you expect a difference? They're almost the same intervention. So it's very hard to capture that statistically. And you would need a ton of studies or one really big multi-site study that has a huge sample size and pretty tight measurement error. So it's tough because most people don't understand the statistics involved. They're following the content treadmill. New study comes out, doesn't look like long muscle lengths do well.
Like the new quad, the leg press one, right? The new one?
Absolutely. Or the new one that compared like a dumbbell lateral raise to a cable lateral raise,
Yeah. I remember that one too. Yeah.
Which are actually the same data collection. And they had them doing both if you look at the preprints. And these are things where you have to look at all the data on the topic, and also think about what are we actually comparing. So like in that leg press comparison, I think it was like 100 degrees to like 140 degrees on average. Those are both decent ranges of motion. So what kind of difference are we expecting in these trained individuals over 8 weeks? Should we be seeing it, And
didn't the lateral raise one, it didn't even go across the body? Is that right? What I saw from the figure? Or is that, or am I missing it? Like the lateral raise, like literally stopped at the side like the dumbbell one, but it was the cable.
Exactly.
So it didn't get the stretch.
Well, no more stretch, but if you think about where does the dumbbell lateral raise get hard, it gets increasingly harder. And when you have the cable set at hip height, it is basically making it so that immediately starting it, you have the highest tension. And the question is that enough of a difference? And it may not be in a trained person over 8 weeks. But it's funny, you can tell how people's biases and prior beliefs influence their interpretation. So I've seen people who are a little more anti long muscle length training, or they're anti it in certain muscle groups, and they try to explain away the delt one. Just like you said, well, if they reach across the body, we would have seen a difference. So basically saying it's not lengthened enough, or we would have seen a difference. But then someone else will look at the leg press study and they'll say, it doesn't matter. Like they were already getting long enough. And you can't have it both ways, or you need to have some belief as to that the quads respond at moderate muscle lengths and not longer, and the delts only respond at the extremist muscle lengths. And we just don't have the data to support that. And some of the speculations about what portion of the length tension relationship on the ascending or descending limb are these muscles operating best are highly speculative. And what we really need to be looking at is actual hypertrophy outcomes rather than some of our often not very well informed, even from a theoretical standpoint, understanding of which muscles might respond better. Because length tension relationships are individual into individual muscles. They're trainable, and they may not operate the same when we're looking at an isometric research study as we do when we're looking at a dynamic contractions. And I think I'm not comfortable with that type of speculation, especially when we have seen long muscle length training operate better in the hamstrings, glutes, quadriceps, calves, biceps, and triceps now. You can find all of the research on those 6 muscle groups are either neutral or positive, all of it. And to me, that means we're probably seeing a real, true, small positive effect size, and it's just very difficult to capture it in all cases. And we should expect mostly null results when we have that type of effect.
In your experience then, how much of your training, let's just call these like extreme range of motion exercises, because it's more than a full range of motion exercise for a lot of them. So like how much of your training program then would involve some of these extreme range of motion, long muscle training, I guess, exercises? Because, there's a trade-off to everything, right? Because the soreness you get from like an incline dumbbell curl is absolutely killer compared to just your regular curl. So does your training involve a lot of this because of the potential benefits? Or is it kind of just like a little icing on the cake maybe at the end of the session?
I think the repeated bout effect is an amazing thing. And people do seem to have differences in their soreness. And you can get a pretty large difference in soreness in the similar hypertrophy outcome as well. I think there's a great study. God, I want to say Gomez, but that might not be the lead author. But anyway, what they did was they compared a 3 times per week frequency versus a 1 times per week frequency, just manipulating basically as a bro split or a full body split. Same volume in true intermediate lifters. Same hypertrophy outcomes in the 2 groups. Same exercises. The only thing that differed was the distribution. So they're training more frequently, fewer sets. And the soreness was way different. On like a scale of 0 to 10, the average soreness across a bunch of muscle groups stayed consistently around 5 or 6 in the once per week group. And it got all the way down to like 1 or 2 or even 0 on average for the more frequent training. So it's very difficult to say like, like if you start exposing yourself to this stuff more frequently, and I know that I tend to be I've been training for 21 years and I trained to failure with high volume and lots of long muscle length training, but I'm a competitive professional natural bodybuilder trying to compete actually this year now. So I don't know that I'm a great case study for this, but I can tell you that in myself, I eased into doing more and more and more of this. And now I would say most of my exercises have what I would describe as a favorable resistance profile, so that I have manipulated them in some way to produce more tension in the initial phase when the muscle is longer. I don't think it needs to be extreme. I think you do need to be cautious, because I have definitely done things where I have like tweaked my brachial nerve, or, gotten a little bit of sciatica because I'm like really trying to go to failure on my 4th set of like lean forward, arched back, seated hamstring curls after RDLs. So I think you still need to think orthopedically intelligently. And if you're shifting towards this, you probably want to introduce it in phases rather than just going all long muscle lengths all the time. But it's definitely something you can adapt to. And we have that, like going to failure produces more soreness. Doing more volume produces more soreness. Training a long muscle length produces more soreness. But those are all things that you can acclimate to pretty well. And then you just kind of have to look to it as like, what's the person's recovery environment and how long have they been training and how does it intermingle with the rest of their training schedule? And you would be very conservative. This is an S&C setting, and maybe not so much as if you're a bodybuilder, and you would just figure out how do I distribute it? Because it's how do I get the most stimulus area into the curve over time if you're looking for all-out hypertrophy.
Perfect. And that takes us to our last topic on protein. And I guess it's kind of been a snowball of literature through the years. And I think the most recent one, you're looking at a dose-response relationship with protein, or I guess maximizing muscle growth with protein intake. I think you were one of the first to do, was it a review on protein intake? Was it your study that was one of the first ones many years ago?
Specifically while someone's in a deficit and they're lifting weights and they're not overweight or with obesity.
That was me in your study, actually.
That's right.
Was that one? Yeah.
I wasn't going to out you, but yes, you participated in my MPhil research on this.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I remember pea protein. So
yes,
that's,
which was very uncommon at the time, and it was an effective tool for blinding because people didn't know which group they were in. They didn't know whether they had the maltodextrin and pea. Yep.
I did not know because they both tasted equally disgusting.
Yes,
I equally disgusting.
Tortured everybody twice in my crossover.
Yeah.
So, the reason I've been talking about protein lately is for 2 reasons. One is we just did this meta-regression you're referring to, which I was one of the authors on, where we basically updated my master's work because we actually had enough to do a meta-regression rather than just a systematic review of 6 studies back in 2013 when I first published on does the amount of protein you can benefit from change if you are leaner, lifting weights, and dieting, which combat athletes are frequently doing, especially in lighter weight classes, weight class restricted strength athletes, and definitely bodybuilders it's super relevant for. So that's why that was my first foray into research, all the way back in 2012 when I moved to New Zealand. And I speculated based upon the very limited data at the time that may be the case, but the systematic review was very limited. And we were like, hey, I think there's enough to do a meta-regression. So I hooked up with Dr. Martin Ruffalo, Dr. Eric Trexler, and we got it together. We got invited to do a paper on this in the Strength Conditioning Journal, and it just recently got published. And we had, I think, between 750 and 800 participants across 2.5 dozen studies. And we saw a linear relationship between protein intake expressed either as grams per kilogram of fat-free mass or total body mass, and the retention, importantly, of lean mass. So these aren't measures of hypertrophy directly, but they're typically like DEXA, 2-compartment model, fat-free mass or lean mass measures. And the break point where we saw wasn't a true break point like Morton and back in the day, but the point at which we saw no lean mass losses was around 1.9 grams per kilogram or 2.5 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass per day. But then even after that, going all the way up to the highest measured intakes, we saw this consistent attenuation of lean mass losses going all the way up to and gaining lean mass in a deficit. So the important thing there is that the effect was quite small. So if you go all the way from the lowest measured intake to the highest, we're looking at a small effect size if we were to use like a Cohen's d, typical family of effect size. That's how we tell the magnitude of something. A p-value just tells you, do we think there's a real difference between these two averages, these two protocols, these two outcomes, two changes, whatever you're doing that t-test or ANOVA or mixed model on. And then the magnitude of the effect is often represented by the effect size, which takes into account the standard deviation, the measure of variance, and the actual raw change. And we're looking at a small effect size. So don't expect a tremendous amount, but it's probably a good idea to eat a little more protein when dieting, probably closer to around 2 grams per kilogram or higher on average. And that is potentially the point where you're plateauing in a surplus. If we look at the most recent meta-analysis on people in an energy balance or surplus by Nunez from 2022, you start to see like right around 2 grams per kilogram, you start to see like the confidence interval, the lower bounds of it start to plateau. And it's very difficult to say that you're benefiting at all from higher intakes. And that's kind of where you maybe want to hit the minimum in a deficit, but the maximum maybe in a surplus, unless you just want to eat more because there's no downside. I think that's kind of cool. But one thing is that most people agree in the sports nutrition world that high protein diets are beneficial for lean mass gain or lean mass retention, supporting strength or supporting hypertrophy or supporting sports performance generally. They only quibble over the distinction between what is a high protein intake. One person might say 1.5 grams per kilogram. One person might say 2. One person might say 3. But everyone agrees that high protein intakes are generally better. But the wild thing, James, and this helps us understand why there's flip-flopping data, if you will, in the volume realm or in the long muscle length realm, that you can really only get a sense of the true effect on the broader population scale when you look at all the data, is that despite everyone having this consensus agreement on protein, if you look at that Nunez 2022 meta-analysis, for example, it's got, in the resistance training comparison, I think 72 different study groups, so not individual studies, but extracted study groups. If you look at that forest plot, only 6 of them actually don't cross that zero line, which means that by traditional null hypothesis frequentist testing, that 95% confidence interval not crossing the zero line means it's a significant difference. That manipulating protein significantly impacted lean mass. That's 8% of the studies. 92% of them are mostly right shifted, but still crossing the zero line. They are a non-significant difference between interventions. And it's not until we have collated, 2,500 participants-ish in the Nunez study across 72 intervention groups do we see this clear, trivial to small effect size of eating more protein. So yeah, eating more protein will help you get more gains. Just don't expect it to do a whole lot. Your resistance training program is a lot more important than whether you hit, say, 1.4 grams per kilogram protein or 2. And there's probably a diminishing returns effect there as well, because when you look at their categorical comparison, they compared less than 1.2 to 1.59, and then 1.6 and higher. And the difference between 1.2 to 1.59 and less than 1.2 is a small effect, but the difference between 1.2 to 1.59 and 1.6 or higher is a trivial effect. So it's this, like going from way too little protein to a moderate protein intake, you're going to get a lot more out of than going from a moderate protein intake to a high protein intake. Much like when you're doing, say, 15 sets and you decide, I want to go up to 20, you may not even notice the difference, even though technically it's probably a little bit better. It's kind of like saying, well, I went out to the ocean and I wanted to make sure that I'm contributing against the fight against global warming. I don't want the seas to take over this beachfront housing. I got out my cup and I took a cup of water out of the ocean and I took it away. So there's now less water in the ocean. It's like, yes, there is less water in the ocean. You can tell it is, 400 mils less. Doesn't matter at all, right? So there are things that can be true but don't matter. And I think as optimalists and maximalists and people who are thinking about like turning over every stone, sometimes we lose sight of that. And if it takes a lot of energy or if it takes focus away from something else to manage something that is actually technically better, but to no meaningful difference that you will ever notice or ever make a difference, it might be a net loss. And I think that's where a lot of people get caught up.
For someone who's maybe, I don't know, let's just say cutting weight for an upcoming fight, weightlifter, for competition bodybuilder, whatever it is, then do you recommend, say, that 2 gram per kilo of body mass as a protein intake, that would be like the minimum to take in then to retain as much muscle as possible?
There's some other factors that matter there. So we did a few sub-analyses, and one of the more convincing ones was we did a comparison with body fat. So we had men and women. It was about a 38%. It's like a 60-40 split if you look at the participants in the meta-regression. And we categorized people as men less than 12% body fat and women less than 20% body fat. And then an intermediary one of men of 19% body fat up to 7% body fat, and women from 27 to like 30-ish. But basically low, moderate, and high body fat percentages. So kind of that intermediate range of, for men, less than 12 to 20, or higher than 20% body fat. And then you can just add, I think, 7 or 8% body fat to that to get the equivalent for women. And an interesting thing we saw is that the slope of the effect of protein intake. So when you're looking at the actual graph of, like, on the y-axis, lean mass gain or retained, x-axis, how much protein, that line is almost flat when you're talking about the people highest in body fat. And then the lower their body fat gets, it shifts to the right and is inclined, which just means that the point at which you see no lean mass losses is higher protein intake the leaner you get, and you're more likely to lose lean mass the leaner you are, which comports with a lot of other data. So if you are, let's say you're 5'6" and you compete in the 109 kilo category as a weightlifter, I wouldn't even change your protein recommendations unless you're just friggin' jacked and maybe you're passing that drug test in nefarious ways. But if you're a relatively high body fat, but you also care a lot about muscle, you have some more wiggle room. And the way we presented this in the paper was 2 different factors. It is the risk of losing lean mass and then the importance of retaining lean mass. And those are 2 factors that are going to influence how high your protein intake should be. So let's say you have someone who casually lifts weights, but it's what they're doing for health as part of a fat loss program, and they're dealing with the fact that they have, type 2 diabetes and obesity. I would say, hey, if you can get up to that kind of 2 gram per kilogram range, or in your case, since you have a high body fat, and that'd probably give you too high of a protein intake, let's use your estimated lean body mass. So 2.5 grams per kilogram of lean body mass. That would be your target. Good job if you can get to it. All good if you're less than that, because you're probably not going to lose muscle mass at all because you've only been training for 3 months and you've got all this endogenous store of tissue. Now, another example would be someone who doesn't want to lose any lean mass, because this first person who's primarily caring about losing body fat, if they lose a kilo of lean mass or gain a kilo of lean mass, so long as they're moving out of this status of having type 2 diabetes, makes 0 difference. Like, they don't care if they can squat 100 kilos or 110. That makes no difference. That's not a concern. Now we have the, maybe not super heavy, but a relatively high body weight class powerlifter or weightlifter. They absolutely want every ounce of muscle they can get, but the risk is low, so long as they're doing other aspects of their cut smart. They're training well, deficit isn't too high. Now it's like, yeah, you probably want to make that your regular target on a day-to-day basis. Like, try to get around there. Higher than that, extra credit. Now, if we're talking about a bodybuilder, or let's say a lightweight or a middleweight who is walking around relatively lean, and then to compete, they get pretty damn lean. Like your Mark Spooner, who looks like he's 6 weeks out when he was doing his weightlifting competitions back when you and I were both around North Sport. This is someone who is trying to go from lean to leaner, and they want all their muscle mass. Now we're looking at that kind of like that's your minimum intake. And then the maximum would probably be where we started to see that the end of that range that we studied, around 3 grams per kilogram of protein for total body mass, would be where I'd cap it, because it's not a big deal if you go over the amount of protein you can benefit from in a surplus, because you have such a large calorie budget. You're playing with 3,000 plus calories for a guy my size, right? But if I'm on a caloric budget and I've only got 1,800, 2,000 calories to play with, and I decide to max out the potential benefit of protein, by definition, I'm lowering the amount of carbohydrates and fat I can eat. And I have to think about, health, sustainability, and how well can I fuel training. And there probably is a point where you end up robbing Peter to pay Paul, and you have to kind of use the art of coaching to decide where that is.
What I find interesting as well, because I love watching full day of eating videos and shit like that, right? It's all the juice bodybuilders and IFBB pros. You look at they break down the macros at the end. It's like 350, 400 grams of protein for the day, and they weigh like maybe 200. Like, holy shit! Like, is there some kind of magic effect of all the juice they're taking that they need more protein, or is that just old bodybuilding dogma that just decided to stick around?
Well, you all have to think about like 350, 400 grams of protein sounds like a lot, but when you weigh 250 pounds, the relative amount isn't that crazy. That's one thing. The second thing is, theoretically, the faster you can grow, the more you'll be able to benefit from a higher protein intake. So if someone can gain a lot of muscle tissue at once, they would theoretically benefit from more amino acids to support it. And, they're not saying everyone who's enhanced is growing really fast, because they start to taper off and they hit limits as well. And, you have to up the dose. But I think it's a mixture of culture and what they've done. Erring on the side of more is better. And then also just the fact that they're big humans, and we don't always think in grams per kilogram or grams per pound when we're looking at big numbers. Ronnie Coleman eating 300 grams of protein, sometimes that's only 1 gram per pound for him, right? He's a big dude. So I think we forget that.
Yeah, nice. Now, I think that was everything I have for you, Eric. I love bringing you on here, and of course we'll keep bringing you on as more of, I guess, the research comes on these different topics and more topics come up, and there's more fitness drama all over Instagram, etc. But where can people find and follow you and keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, I think if people are really interested in more on long muscle length research, protein research, volume research, then the best place to go is massresearchreview.com. We have training guides. If you want to actually get a subscription to our research review, you can get my full thoughts on this. But we also put out a lot of free content and have download guides, best of issue, for people who are and just want to get a feel for what we do and see if it's something that would benefit them. And then if you want to follow me for like bodybuilding content, then 3dmusclejourney.com. If you're not a fighter, but you're happening to be listening to me because you actually want to put on the Speedo or the lifting singlet, then 3dmusclejourney.com is the place to go.
Perfect. I'll link those in the description. Make sure you also check out the Iron Culture podcast as well, because that is bomb. And as I mentioned to Eric before the podcast, one of the comments on one of my podcasts recently was, this is the Iron Culture for the MMA world. So if you enjoy this and you like lifting, then check out Iron Culture as well. But I appreciate you coming on, Eric, and we'll chat soon.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.